The boy with no shoes. Wind was cold that morning, though the sun had already risen above the tall glass buildings of Mumbai. The streets were awake with honking cars, food carts steaming with hot chai and samosas, and the rush of feet hurrying. To work, nobody noticed the small boy sitting alone near the corner of a tea stall. He had no shoes. His shirt was torn. His eyes, however, were wide and watchful, as though he was waiting for something important to happen. Sundar Pichai had just arrived in India for a short visit. He didn't come often now. His life in America was busy, filled with meetings, interviews, and decisions that affected millions of people. But this morning, he wanted to take a quiet walk through the streets of his childhood city before heading to his meetings. As he stepped out of his car, wearing a simple gray jacket and jeans, Sundar felt a familiar ache in his chest. So much had changed. The streets seemed smaller now, but the smells and sounds were the same. He could almost hear the voice of his mother calling him home for lunch. He walked slowly, unnoticed by the crowds. He stopped at a tea stall and ordered a cup of chai, breathing in the warm, spicy scent. That was when he saw the boy. The boy was crouched next to a cracked wall, his arms wrapped around his knees. He watched every customer at the stall as if measuring who might give him something to eat. When his eyes met Sundar's, the boy didn't look away. Instead, he stood up and approached. "Sir," the boy said softly, "do you have some food?" "I'm very hungry." The voice was thin but steady. Sundar looked at him closely. He could see the dirt on his cheeks, the faint scar across his brow, the way his fingers trembled slightly. But there was something else too, a quiet strength, a dignity in the way he spoke. Sundar crouched down till they were at eye level. "What is your name?" he asked. "Arjun," the boy replied. The tea vendor glanced at them but said nothing. The other customers shuffled past. Uninterested, Sundar handed Arjun his cup of chai. "Drink this?" he said. Arjun hesitated, then took the cup and drank greedily. Sundar ordered 2 samosas and gave one to the boy. As they sat there, eating in silence, Sundar couldn't help but feel something stir inside him. He remembered being a boy himself, walking through these same streets, dreaming of something better. He thought about the nights his family had to stretch one meal into 2 days. And he wondered how many Arjuns were out there still waiting for someone to notice them. "Where are your parents?" Sundar asked quietly. Arjun looked down at the ground. "Gone," he whispered. "Since last year." The words hung in the air between them. Sundar felt his throat tighten. He reached into his pocket and pulled out some money. But the boy shook his head. "I don't want money," Arjun said firmly. "Just food." That surprised Sundar. Most children would grab the money and run. But Arjun stood there, his gaze steady, his chin raised just slightly. "Come with me," Sundar said finally. They walked together down the street, past fruit sellers and beggars, past honking rickshaws and children playing cricket. Sundar asked him more questions, but the boy only gave short answers. He learned that Arjun slept near the railway station, that he sometimes worked at a mechanic shop for a few rupees, and that he had a younger sister who was sick. As they reached a quiet park at the edge of the city center, Sundar stopped and sat on a bench. He motioned for Arjun to sit beside him. "Do you know who I am?" Sundar asked gently. Arjun looked at him, then shook his head. Sundar smiled faintly. "That's good," he said. "It means you're honest." For a long moment, they just sat there, watching the morning light spill over the grass. Then Arjun asked, "Why did you help me?" Sundar didn't answer right away. He thought about all the people who had helped him when he was young, teachers, neighbors, strangers who had shown him kindness. He thought about how one small act could change a life. "Because someone once helped me," he said finally. Suddenly, a sharp cry echoed from the park entrance. A group of boys, older and rougher, were walking toward them. They were laughing loudly, and one of them pointed at Arjun. "There he is," the tallest boy shouted. "You think you can hide here? You still owe us." Arjun's face went pale. He stood up quickly, his hands clenched into fists. Sundar rose too, placing a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. "What's going on?" he asked. The boys didn't even look at him. They closed in on Arjun, pushing and shouting. You took food from our corner. You're not allowed to beg there. You have to pay. Sundar stepped in front of Arjun, his calm eyes meeting theirs. Leave him alone, he said quietly. But the boys only laughed louder. One of them shoved Sundar hard. Another grabbed Arjun's shirt and yanked him forward. Before Sundar could react, one of the boys pulled a small knife from his pocket. If you don't pay now, the boy snarled, we'll make sure you don't come back. The air seemed to grow colder. Sundar felt a surge of anger rise inside him. But before he could speak, Arjun did something unexpected. He stepped forward, away from Sundar, and looked straight at the boy with the knife. His voice was steady, though his hands trembled. I won't pay you, he said. I won't steal. Or beg for you. If you want to hurt me, do it now. The park fell silent. The other boys stared at Arjun in shock. Then, suddenly, the boy with the knife lunged forward. But at that exact moment, Sundar grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing the knife to clatter to the ground. The boy cried out in pain. Enough, Sundar said. His voice low and firm. The boys scattered, muttering curses as they ran. When it was over, Arjun stood frozen, breathing hard. Sundar picked up the knife and tossed it into a nearby trash bin. Then he turned to Arjun. You're brave, he said. But even the brave need help sometimes. Arjun finally looked up at him, his eyes filled with something Sundar recognized. Not just fear, but hope. Just then, Sundar's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was his assistant, reminding him of his next meeting. He glanced at the screen, then back at the boy. He knew he couldn't just walk away now. Come with me, Sundar said again, more firmly this time. But before they could take another step, a black car pulled up near the park entrance. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his face grim. He walked straight towards Sundar, ignoring Arjun completely. Sir, the man said urgently, there's a problem at the office. They need you now. It's serious. Sundar felt his heart sink. He looked at Arjun and then at the man. He felt the weight of two worlds pulling at him. Arjun was watching him closely, his small hands gripping the edge of his torn shirt. For the first time in years, Sundar didn't know what to say. And in that silent moment, a new question began to form. In his mind, one that would change everything. The choice of air around them felt heavy, as if even the birds had stopped singing for a moment. Sundar stood there with his phone still buzzing in his pocket, and the suited man waiting impatiently by the car. Arjun stood just behind him, his small face pale, but his dark eyes wide, unblinking. The man in the suit stepped closer and spoke. In a lower, sharper tone this time. Double quote, sir. I've been instructed to bring you right now. There's a serious issue with the product launch. The press is waiting. Shareholders are on the call already. You cannot delay. The man didn't even glance at Arjun, as if he was nothing more than a piece of dust blown in by the morning wind. Sundar felt a strange anger rise in him at that. A quiet but deep anger, though his voice stayed calm when he replied. Give me a moment, he said firmly. The man shifted on his feet and looked down at his watch. Then he stepped back, muttering something under his breath as he pulled out his own phone. Sundar turned to Arjun, crouching slightly so he could see him clearly. The boy looked unsure now, as if he was expecting Sundar to walk away and leave him there, like everyone else before. Sundar could see it in his eyes, that flicker of disappointment trying hard to turn into numbness. He remembered that look. He had seen it before in the mirror when he was younger. Sundar took a deep breath. He looked at the boy's bare feet, the frayed edge of his shirt, the faint smudge of dirt across his cheek, and something inside him shifted. Arjun, he said quietly, I have to tell you something. The boy tilted his head slightly, but said nothing. His lips pressed into a thin line. There's a part of my life, Sundar began slowly, choosing his words with care, where I am surrounded by very important people, very big problems, and very bright lights. They are waiting for me, right? Now, they think they need me. He paused and searched the boy's face. But they don't know, he continued, his voice softer now. That right here, on this bench, sitting with you, I found a bigger problem, and maybe the most important person I've met in a long time. Arjun blinked at him, confused. But you're busy, he whispered. Sundar smiled faintly and shook his head. Not too busy for this. He straightened up and turned toward the man in the suit. You go ahead, he said firmly. Tell. Then I'll join when I can. The man's mouth fell open slightly. Sir, I don't think you understand. But Sundar raised a hand and cut him off. No, he said. You don't understand. I'll come when I'm ready. The man glanced at Arjun, then back at Sundar, clearly disapproving, but he didn't dare argue further. He got back into the car and drove away, leaving a faint smell of exhaust behind him. When the car was gone, Sundar let out a long breath and turned back to Arjun, who was staring up at him with a look that was equal parts awe and confusion. Asterisk. Why did you stay? Arjun asked finally, his voice no louder than a whisper. Sundar crouched again and looked him straight in the eyes. Because I see myself in you, he said simply. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the park returned slowly. The distant cries of children playing, the rustle of leaves in the warm breeze, the faint hum of traffic beyond the gates. Then Sundar asked, You said you have a sister? Arjun nodded, his eyes suddenly clouded with worry. She's very sick. She hasn't eaten much. Sometimes she doesn't wake up till late. I don't know what to do. The words came out in a rush now, as if a dam inside him had broken. I tried to get work at the market, but they don't want me there anymore. I tried to help the mechanic, but he says I'm too small. I begged yesterday, and they took my money. I don't. His voice cracked. I don't know what else to do. His shoulders trembled slightly. Sundar reached out and placed a steady hand on the boy's arm. It's okay, he said softly. You don't have to know everything today. Arjun's jaw tightened as though he was trying hard not to cry. He looked down at his feet, silent again. Sundar stood up and held out his hand. Show me where. She is, he said. Arjun hesitated only a moment before slipping his small hand into Sundar's. They walked together out of the park and back into the city streets, which were even busier now. People rushed past them without a second glance, but Sundar kept his focus on Arjun, who led him through narrow alleys and across dusty roads, weaving through the maze of the city with practiced ease. After nearly 30 minutes, they reached a hidden lane near the railway station, lined with broken bricks and scraps of plastic sheets hanging from makeshift poles. It smelled faintly of smoke and damp earth. Arjun stopped in front of what looked like a pile of old tarps strung together. To form a small shelter dot inside, a little girl lay on her side on a thin mat, her knees drawn up to her chest. She was so still that Sundar felt his stomach clench in fear. He knelt down quickly and touched her forehead. She was burning with fever. She needs a doctor, Sundar said immediately. Arjun crouched beside her, his voice shaky. There's no doctor here. They don't come. We just wait. Not anymore, Sundar said firmly. He pulled out his phone and called his driver, giving him the location. Within minutes, a black car appeared at the end of the lane. Sundar lifted the little girl carefully into his arms. Her skin was hot and dry, and she whimpered faintly but didn't wake Dot as they drove toward the hospital. Sundar glanced at Arjun sitting beside him. The boy was staring at his sister, his hands clenched into fists, his lips moving soundlessly as if he were praying. Dot at the hospital. Doctors and nurses rushed to take the little girl. They promised to run tests and bring her fever down. Sundar stayed by Arjun's side the whole time, waiting in the cold white corridor while the machines beeped behind the closed door. Dot finally. A nurse came out and said the girl was stable for now. They would need to keep her overnight and monitor her closely. Sundar thanked her and turned to Arjun, who looked both relieved and terrified at the same time. She's going to be okay, Sundar said quietly. Arjun nodded but said nothing. Instead, he walked over to the door and pressed his palm gently against it, as if to assure himself she was really there. Later, as the sun began to set outside the hospital windows, Sundar bought 2 cups of chai from a vending machine and handed one to Arjun. They sat in silence, sipping the warm tea as the city lights blinked on in the distance. Then Arjun asked, the question that had clearly been sitting in his chest all day. Are you going to leave now? The words were soft but heavy. Sundar sat down his cup and looked at him for a long moment before answering. Do you want me to? He asked. Arjun shook his head quickly. No, he whispered. Sundar reached over and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Then I'm not going anywhere, he said for the first time all day. A faint smile touched Arjun's lips, but just as the moment settled between them, Sundar's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, dozens of missed calls and messages flashing urgently, he sighed. Then slipped the phone back into his pocket without answering. But something was changing. He could feel it deep in his bones, and just as he was about to speak, a doctor came running down the hall, his face pale. Sir, the doctor called out breathlessly. You need to come now. Something's happened. Sundar and Arjun exchanged a terrified look and jumped to their feet. Asterisk the storm inside it. Doctor's voice still hung in the air as Sundar and Arjun followed him down the corridor, their footsteps echoing off the white walls. The boy ran ahead, his small frame darting around nurses and carts, his breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. Sundar stayed close behind, his own chest tight, his mind a tangle of questions and dread. When they reached the room, the doctor stopped abruptly and turned, his eyes full of worry. He spoke in a low, hurried tone, but the words hit Sundar and Arjun like a thunderclap. She's gone into shock, the doctor said. Her fever spiked suddenly and she stopped breathing for a few seconds. We're working to stabilize her. Now, but... He didn't finish the sentence. Before Sundar could respond, Arjun pushed past the doctor and pressed himself against the glass window that looked into the room. Inside, the little girl lay motionless on the bed, her small chest rising and falling unevenly. Two nurses worked around her, checking tubes and monitors, while another doctor adjusted something on the machine that beeped frantically at her side. Arjun's hands flattened against the glass as if he could somehow reach her through it. His whole body shook. Sundar stepped closer and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, but Arjun didn't move, didn't even blink. His eyes stayed fixed on his sister, a silent storm brewing behind them. Sundar knew that storm. He had felt it himself once, the helplessness of watching someone you love slip beyond your reach. The rage that builds when the world seems cruel and indifferent. They're helping her, Sundar said softly, though he wasn't sure if. The words reached the boy at all, after what felt like an eternity. One of the nurses came out, her expression tired but calm. We managed to bring her back, she said. She's stable again. But we need to keep monitoring her overnight. She's very weak. Arjun sagged against the wall, his shoulders collapsing, as though all the strength had drained out of him. Sundar caught him before he fell, steadying him with both hands. The boy's head dropped forward, and a single tear slipped down his cheek, leaving a clean line through the dust. Thank you, Sundar murmured to the nurse. She nodded and went back inside after a long silence. Arjun finally spoke, his voice hoarse and low. Why does this keep happening to us? Sundar crouched down to meet his eyes. I don't know, he admitted quietly. But I do know you're stronger than you think. The boy stared at him, searching for something. Perhaps a reason to believe, perhaps just someone to stand there and not turn away. Eventually, the little girl drifted into a fitful sleep. The nurses dimmed the lights and left the two of them alone outside the room. Sundar guided Arjun to a bench in the hallway, and they sat there as the night deepened around them. The hum of the hospital filling the silence. Arjun leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and spoke without looking up. When my parents died, I promised her I'd take care of her. I told her nothing bad would happen to her. I told her I'd protect her no matter what. But I can't. I can't even feed her most days. I'm just a boy. His voice cracked on the last words. Sundar listened quietly, letting the boy's confession hang in the air. Then he said gently, You're not just a boy, Arjun. You're her whole world. And that matters more than you know. Arjun sniffed and finally looked up at him. How do you know? Sundar smiled faintly. Because once I was just a boy too. I made a promise like that, and I thought I couldn't keep it. But I kept going anyway. The boy's eyes narrowed. Slightly. Curious. What happened? Sundar leaned back, letting the memory take shape. When I was your age, he began slowly. We lived in a small house. My father worked hard, but we didn't have much. I used to sleep on the floor. And sometimes there wasn't enough food. I would walk through the streets and look at the big houses, the tall buildings, and wonder if I would ever belong anywhere. I felt invisible most of the time, but my mother, she always believed in me. She told me that even the smallest voice can change something if it refuses to stay quiet. I held on to that. He paused, watching Arjun absorb the words. So I studied. I worked, and I never forgot where I came from. But even now, when I stand in front of big crowds and people clap and call me important, I still feel like that. Boy sometimes, wondering if I belong. But I keep going. Arjun's brow furrowed as he thought about this. Do you still hear your mother's voice? He asked. Sundar nodded slowly. Every day, he said. Just then. A faint sound came from inside the room. The little girl stirring in her sleep, murmuring something. Arjun stood and pressed his forehead to the glass again, whispering her name under his breath. After a while, Sundar checked his watch. It was late, but the boy showed no signs of leaving her side. Arjun, Sundar said softly, we should get you something to eat. But the boy shook his head. I'm not hungry, he murmured still. Sundar went down to the cafeteria and returned with 2 plates of rice and dal, setting one in front of him. They ate quietly, the smell of spices mingling with the faint scent of antiseptic that clung to the hallway. When they finished, Sundar leaned back and watched Arjun watching his sister through the glass. His small hands pressed together, his lips moving in silent prayer. Then, without warning, the boy turned to him and asked, will you stay? Till morning? The question was so soft, so full of fragile hope, that Sundar felt his chest tighten. He nodded without hesitation. I'll stay, he said. They sat through the night together, dozing off and waking again to the steady rhythm of the machines. At one point, Sundar woke to find Arjun's head resting against his shoulder. Fast asleep, his hands still folded on his lap, he looked down at the boy and thought of all the people who had once carried him through his darkest nights. He thought of the teachers who stayed after school to help him, the neighbor who gave him his first pair of shoes, the stranger who bought him a book. When he couldn't afford one, he thought of how easy it would have been for him to miss this moment. To have walked away when the man in the suit had called and now, sitting there in the quiet, he felt something inside him shift again, a quiet promise forming. Deeper and stronger than before. Just as dawn began to lighten the sky outside, the doctor returned. This time, his expression was calmer, almost relieved. She's stable, the doctor said. The worst is over. Arjun's eyes lit up, his small fists clenching in relief. Sundar let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Doctor added, she needs proper care now. Food, medicine, rest. But she's a fighter. She'll recover. Arjun nodded fiercely. She's always been a fighter, he said. As the morning sun poured through the hospital windows, painting the white walls gold, Sundar stood and stretched. He looked down at Arjun, who was now smiling faintly through his exhaustion. You kept your promise, Sundar said quietly. Arjun shook his head. Not alone, he replied. Sundar felt a warmth spread through his chest at those words. But just as he reached into his pocket to call his driver, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't just a message. It was a video call. The screen lit up with his assistant's anxious face. Sir, the assistant began urgently. There's a situation. Someone leaked photos of you at the hospital with the boy. It's all over the news. People are asking questions. The board wants you on a call immediately. Sundar froze, the phone heavy in his hand. Through the small glass window, he could see Arjun's sister sleeping peacefully now, the faint rise and fall of her chest steady at last. And next to him, Arjun watched Sundar carefully. his eyes dark and unreadable. The hallway suddenly felt too quiet, too bright, as if the whole world had narrowed to this one impossible choice: to walk back into his world of boardrooms and headlines, or to stand here quietly and finish what he had started. Assistant's voice crackled from the phone. "Sir, are you there? What should I tell them?" Sundar looked at the boy dot, and for the first time in a long time, he truly didn't know what to say. Asterisk, the breaking point phone in Sundar's hand felt heavier with each passing second. His assistant's voice crackled again, more urgent this time. "Sir, are you still there? They're waiting. The board needs you on the line now. The media is already speculating. This could turn into a PR disaster." Sundar's fingers tightened around the device, and for a moment he considered simply ending the call without a word. But years of discipline, of responsibility, of carrying the weight of a global company kept him frozen in place. He could hear the faint murmur of voices on the other end of the call, a dozen powerful people waiting impatiently for his decision. Then he looked at Arjun. The boy stood quietly beside him, his small hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. He wasn't saying anything, but his dark eyes spoke volumes. Eyes that still carried the storm of the night before. Eyes that held the same silent question. "Are you going to leave now?" Sundar swallowed hard and finally spoke into the phone, his voice low but steady. "Tell them I'll call back when I can." He said that there was a stunned pause on the other end of the line before his assistant stammered. "But, sir." Sundar cut him off with a calm but firm reply, "When I can." Then he ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He let out a long breath, feeling a strange mixture of relief and fear. All his life he had lived by the rules of the other world: deadlines, targets, appearances. But here, in this quiet corridor, none of that seemed to matter anymore. Arjun watched him carefully, his expression still unreadable. After a long moment, he whispered, "Thank you." Sundar managed a faint smile. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Yes, I do," Arjun insisted softly. They sat together on the bench again, waiting as the morning sun rose higher outside the hospital windows. Nurses passed by occasionally, some glancing at Sundar with curiosity, but saying nothing. The faint beeping of machines and the quiet shuffle of feet filled the silence between them. After a while, Arjun spoke again. "Will she be okay now?" Sundar hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She's safe for now. But she'd need more than just tonight. She need proper care, medicine, food, maybe even school when she's stronger." Arjun's shoulders sagged slightly as the weight of those words sank in. He stared down at his hands, his fingers curling into fists. "How am I supposed to give her all that?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I can't even keep her warm at night." His honesty cut through Sundar like a blade. He thought of his own childhood again. The nights he lay awake wondering the same thing. Quiet. Terror of feeling small and powerless. "You don't have to do it alone," Sundar said gently. But before Arjun could respond, a sudden commotion erupted down the hallway. Voices raised. Footsteps running. Sundar stood quickly, his body tensing as he saw two men in crisps pushing their way toward him. They carried cameras and microphones, and behind them trailed a small crowd of hospital staff and curious onlookers. "There he is," one of the men called out, his voice sharp and triumphant. "Mr. Pichai, care to explain why you've abandoned your responsibility is to sit in a public hospital with a street child?" The shareholders are furious. The board has called an emergency vote. People are saying this is unprofessional, even reckless. Care to comment? The man thrust a microphone towards Sundar's face, while the second man raised a camera. Began snapping photos. Arjun shrank back instinctively, his hands gripping the edge of the bench, his eyes wide with fear and shame. Sundar stepped in front of him immediately, his jaw tight. "You need to leave," Sundar said firmly. But the reporter pressed closer, ignoring him. "What exactly is your relationship with this boy? Is this a publicity stunt? A charity experiment? What message are you sending to your employees and your investors by being here instead of at the press conference?" The words came fast and sharp, each one like a slap in the quiet hospital corridor. The camera clicked over and over. Arjun's cheeks flushed a deep red, his eyes darting to the floor. Sundar could feel the boy's small body trembling behind him. He took a slow breath, then straightened to his full height and turned to face the reporter squarely. "This boy," Sundar began, his voice quiet but cutting through the noise, "is not a stunt. He is not a story for you to sell. He is a human being. And right now, he and his sister need help more than I need a boardroom full of investors." The corridor fell silent for a moment. The reporter opened his mouth to speak again, but Sundar raised a hand. "You want a story?" he said, his voice growing stronger. "Here it is. I grew up on streets not very different from these. I walked to school barefoot some days. I skipped meals so my younger brother could eat. And I know what it feels like to be invisible, to have everyone pass by you without looking, without caring." He glanced back at Arjun, who stared up at him now, wide-eyed. "But someone once noticed me," Sundar continued. "Someone once believed in me when I had nothing. And because of that, I stand here today." The reporters shifted uncomfortably, their microphones lowering slightly. Sundar took another step closer to them, his eyes calm and steady. "So if you think sitting here, helping this boy and his sister, makes me less of a leader, then you've misunderstood everything about leadership." He let the words hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. Then he turned away from them and crouched down in front of Arjun, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You don't need to be ashamed," Sundar said quietly. Arjun nodded faintly. His cheeks still flushed, but his eyes beginning to clear. The reporters finally retreated, muttering to each other, their cameras still clicking as they disappeared back down the hallway. The curious onlookers drifted away too, leaving them alone again. Sundar sat back on the bench and let out a long breath. Arjun sat beside him, still silent, but his small hand crept into Sundar's and stayed there. After a while, Arjun asked softly, "What happens now?" Sundar looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Now," he said, "we make a plan." But even as he spoke, his phone buzzed again. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again and again. Finally, he glanced at the screen. Dozens of missed calls, messages, and one sharp warning from the chairman of the board. "If you don't return immediately, we will be forced to reconsider your position." Sundar stared at the words, feeling a cold weight settle in his stomach. He closed his eyes for a moment, hearing only the faint beeping of machines and the quiet breathing of the boy beside him. He thought of the boardrooms, the flashing cameras, the applause that always sounded just a little too hollow. Asterisk. And then he thought of Arjun, of the quiet storm in the boy's eyes, of the way he had stood between him and a knife, of the way he had refused to take money but had asked for food instead. He opened his eyes and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Just then, the doctor came out of the room with a clipboard in hand. He approached them, his expression serious but calm. "We've stabilized your sister," he told Arjun, "but we need to transfer her to a better facility for longer care. She's very weak and she needs proper nutrition and rest." Arjun nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Whatever it takes," he said quietly. The doctor gave Sundar a meaningful look. "It won't be easy," he added. Sundar rose to his feet, his gaze steady. "Then we'll make it happen," he said. The doctor nodded and went back inside, leaving the two of them standing alone again. Sundar turned to Arjun. "Are you ready?" Arjun lifted his chin slightly, a flicker of defiance in his eyes now. "Yes," he said. But just as they were about to leave the hospital corridor, another figure appeared at the far end, a tall man in a dark suit, flanked by two others, their faces grim and unyielding. Sundar recognized them instantly. They were from the board. The man stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. He stopped a few feet away and spoke in a low, controlled voice. "We warned you," he said coldly. "If you walk out of here with that boy, don't bother coming back." Arjun froze, his hand tightening in Sundar's. The corridor fell silent again, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. Sundar looked down at the boy, then back, at the men blocking his path, and though his chest ached and his mind screamed with doubt, his next step was clear. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and began walking toward them, the boy's small hand still firmly in his asterisk. The walk through fiery air in the corridor felt heavy, almost suffocating, as Sundar took his first step toward the men in suits. Each footfall echoed like a drumbeat. Against the cold tiles, and Arjun's small hand tightened in his. The boy glanced up at him, his eyes wide, but Sundar kept his gaze forward. His face calm, though his chest burned with a quiet fury. The tallest man, clearly the one in charge, stood perfectly still, his arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. He spoke in a low, clipped voice as Sundar approached. "This is your final warning," the man said, his words cold enough to chill the air. "You can turn around now and salvage your position, or you can keep walking and lose everything. It's your choice." Sundar stopped just a few feet away, close enough to see the faint lines of irritation on the man's face, close enough to feel the weight of his contempt. For a moment, Sundar said nothing. He simply stood there, feeling the quiet strength of the boy's hand in his. The memory of Arjun's sister lying fragile and still in her hospital bed behind him, and the silent expectations of a world that had watched him climb to the top, only to demand he forget where he came from. He thought of all the choices he had made to get here, the long nights studying under a flickering lamp, the sacrifices his parents made, the small humiliations he endured, the countless moments when he had swallowed his pride and kept moving because he believed it was the only way forward. But now, for the first time, he wondered if moving forward meant letting go of the very thing that had carried him this far. His ability to see himself in the eyes of the invisible, to feel the weight of another's pain and choose to stand beside them anyway. He looked down at Arjun, who stood perfectly still, watching him with a quiet question in his eyes. And in that instant, Sundar knew what his answer would be. He raised his head and met the tall man's gaze without flinching. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "Then I lose everything." He said that the man's jaw tightened, and a flicker of disbelief crossed his face. "You're making a mistake," he said sharply. "No," Sundar replied, his voice steady. "I've made plenty of mistakes in my life, but not this one." Without another word, he stepped forward. The board members parted reluctantly, their faces hard with disapproval, but none of them dared stop him. He walked past them, the boy at his side, and didn't look back as he reached the end of the corridor. The sun outside spilled through the glass doors, bathing the hospital lobby in warm gold. The light felt different now, not just brighter, but heavier somehow, carrying the weight of everything he had just chosen to leave behind. The doors slid open with a faint hiss, and they stepped out into the morning air. The city was waking. Up around them, cars honked, vendors shouted, rickshaws clattered over potholes, but for a moment it all seemed to quiet as they stood there. Taking it in, Arjun's voice was barely more than a whisper. "Why did you do that?" Sundar crouched down so they were eye to eye. "Because," he said softly, "you don't walk away from someone who needs you just to keep people who don't." Arjun stared at him for a long moment, his lips pressed together, then nodded once, as if he understood more than his age would suggest. They made their way back toward the car, which still waited at the curb. The driver gave Sundar a strange look but said nothing as he held the door open. The ride to the other hospital was quiet at first. Arjun stared out the window, his hand resting on the glass, watching the streets blur by. Sundar leaned back in, his seat feeling the weight of his decision settle over him like a heavy cloak. Somewhere deep inside, fear gnawed at him, fear of what he had just lost, fear of what lay ahead. But beneath the fear was something else too, something steady, something that felt like a faint ember of who he used to be, glowing again after. Years of being buried under titles and responsibilities. When they arrived, the new hospital was larger, cleaner, quieter. Nurses came out to greet them, and Arjun's sister was transferred gently from one stretcher to another. Sundar stayed close as doctors explained the plan. Better medication, proper nutrition, and rest. It would take weeks, maybe months, but she could recover fully here when they wheeled her away. Arjun followed at a distance, his small hands clasped tightly, his chin held high despite the worry in his eyes. Sundar stayed behind at the reception desk to sign papers and arrange for the bills to be covered. When he finally caught up with Arjun, he found the boy standing outside his sister's new room watching through the glass as nurses adjusted her blankets and hooked up, and Arjun spoke without turning around. She looks better already. She's going to be okay, Sundar said gently. After a long silence, Arjun finally asked, "What happens now?" "Where do we go?" Sundar crouched down beside him. "Now," he said slowly, "you both rest. And when she's stronger, we figure out the next step." Arjun glanced at him, his eyes sharp. "Why are you still here?" he asked softly. Sundar smiled faintly. "Because someone was there for me once," he said simply. "And because I don't want to forget what it feels like to matter to someone who has nothing else." The boy looked at him for a long time, then nodded as if that answer was enough. The hours passed slowly. The doctors came and went. The sun sank low and painted the walls of the room in gold and then deep blue. Sundar stood by the window, watching as the city lights flickered on one by one, thinking of all the places he was supposed to be right now. All the people waiting for him to explain himself, all the headlines that would surely follow. And yet, here, in this quiet room with a boy and his fragile sister, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. A quiet kind of peace. Heavy and real. Just as he let himself exhale, his phone vibrated again. He ignored it. But this time it buzzed a second and third time, then began to ring. Arjun glanced at him. "You should answer," he said softly. Sundar hesitated, then finally picked it up. The voice on the other end was sharp and furious. "You've embarrassed this company," the chairman snapped. "You've betrayed the trust of everyone who believed in you. You've walked away from everything we built together for what? Some street kid? You are finished here? Do you understand?" "Finished." Sundar closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him without reply. When the man finally stopped to catch his breath, Sundar spoke. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "This is the first right thing I've done in a long time." Then he ended the call and dropped the phone back into his pocket. When he opened his eyes, Arjun was watching him closely, his head tilted slightly. "You don't seem scared," the boy said. Sundar let out a faint laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I am," he admitted, "but not of them." He glanced through the glass at the girl sleeping peacefully on the bed. "I'm more scared of forgetting who I really am," he added. Arjun nodded thoughtfully, as though he understood. Hours later, after the doctors confirmed that the girl was stable enough to sleep through the night, Sundar arranged for a small room next to hers where Arjun could rest. He tucked the boy into bed, and for a moment he just stood there, watching as Arjun's eyes fluttered shut. His breathing finally slow and steady. When he stepped out into the hallway, he felt the full weight of exhaustion crash down on him. But before he could sit, his phone buzzed again, this time with a single message. Short and chilling. "You don't understand what you've started. This isn't over. We'll make sure you regret this." Sundar stared at the words, a faint chill running through him. He looked back at the door to Arjun's room, then at the faint glow of the city beyond the window.